The Habsburgs, one of the most powerful dynasties of all time. As German kings, as emperors of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, and most recently as emperors of Austria and kings of Hungary, they shaped the course of European history for centuries. As kings of Spain, they ruled over a new world empire in which the sun did not set. A sphere of influence that stretched from North Africa and reached as far as California. A combination of artful diplomacy and ruthless power politics turned an insignificant ducal family into a world-class dynasty. The Habsburgs waged wars and made marriage alliances with the same fervor, securing their influence and tying their fortunes to the significant noble families of Europe. Sometimes they took land and titles by force, but often they were just lucky enough to outlive their rivals. From the beginning of the 13th century, the Habsburgs continuously expanded their rule from their homeland in the west of the Holy Roman Empire. They began to move east to the region of present-day Austria, then to Bohemia and Hungary. Later, large regions and nations such as the Netherlands, Burgundy, Castile, and Aragon were added. Whole nations were defined and later subsumed in the course of history. Others were ruled by the dynasty for many centuries. After the tumult of the First World War, the Habsburg Empire disappeared forever. But to this day, many countries, cities, and regions are shaped by their time within its culture. Castles and palaces, monasteries and art collections remind us of this once so powerful dynasty. We will now travel through time to the most important locations that defined the Habsburgs. A journey that leads through more than a dozen present-day European states and back to the world more than 1,000 years ago. Vienna, a Habsburg resident city since the 13th century. From here, they ruled their hereditary lands, the Holy Roman Empire, and the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. The Vienna Hofburg, in the heart of the city, was the center of power for a long time and remains a symbol of their unique rise today. In the oldest part of the Hofburg, the board and employees of Via Habsburg, a cross-border cultural project of the Council of Europe, meet regularly.
Based on the Habsburg family history, we can also present the Via Habsburg through the cities that are already members and those that want to become members. This highlights a shared European history that transcends today's borders, emphasizing how these borders have shifted over time. It also allows us to reflect on the tremendous values and commonalities that have defined Europe in the past.
The Via Habsburg connects the dynasty's most significant places of activity across Central and Eastern Europe.
First, we aim to conduct research by gathering all available knowledge on the topic, identifying contributions from individual cities, and assessing existing research. Second, we focus on engaging young people by presenting history in a socially exciting manner. This involves translating historical events into contemporary contexts, exploring societal dynamics, family structures, and youth experiences of the past. In modern terms, this is known as storytelling. Our goal is to provide a nuanced perspective on history.
Founded in Alsace, the Habsburgs' homeland, the Via Habsburg Association is now based in Vienna's Hofburg. This mirrors the evolution of the princely dynasty, reflected in the Habsburgs' architectural development.
The Vienna Hofburg, the imperial castle, has grown from an old medieval castle that was part of the city fortifications. This was really the kind of castle you would imagine with towers and drawbridges and so on. And over time, after it was established as an imperial residence, it was expanded again and again. That is, the imperial family has grown, things have changed, and new parts were added to the castle about every 80 to 100 years. But the older structures were not demolished. This means that we have all architectural styles represented here. And it is really a grown structure that does not look like a classic castle or like a classic palace, but it is a complexity of wings, courtyards, and connections, which of course also make orientation in the imperial castle relatively difficult. But that's exactly the charm of our Hofburg in Vienna, because it's such a great structure which has been grown over for centuries.
What shaped the Hofburg and its architectural evolution over the centuries was the fact that it lacked sufficient space to meet the demands of the time. But why was there such a constant need for expansion? This is largely due to the fact that the Hofburg has, over the centuries, functioned as a city within a city. This remains true today, as the Hofburg is deeply intertwined with the life of the city, with areas that are regularly frequented by the public. Moreover, it wasn't just the imperial family that resided here. The entire court, along with its staff, also made the Hofburg their home. As a result, there were always several thousand people living and working within its walls. Covering an area of 30 hectares, the Vienna Hofburg is one of the largest palace complexes in the world. Often criticized for its austere appearance, the Hofburg nevertheless served as a powerful symbol of the Habsburgs' authority throughout the centuries. The rulers of the House of Austria understood the importance of external representation. Emperor Charles VI, for example, symbolically positioned himself as the center of the universe in the State Hall of the National Library. The stars and planets, as well as the accumulated knowledge of his era and his ancestors, all seemed to revolve around him. But who were the Habsburgs? Where did they come from to play a decisive role in shaping the fate of the European continent and the world for 700 years? In the canton of Aargau in eastern Switzerland, the Habsburg rises on a hill, or at least what still exists today of the once imposing castle complex from the 11th century. Although the family is much older, this site is considered the ancestral seat of the Habsburgs.
Presumably, the Habsburg descendants of the ducal family of the Ettichons are named after the Frankish Duke Etiko, who ruled in Alsace during the 7th century. Later, we encounter Guntram the Rich, who is regarded as the direct predecessor of the Habsburgs. This Guntram the Rich may be the same as a count in Alsace who was stripped of his possessions in 952 due to accusations of high treason. His son, Lanzarin of Altenburg, appears to have already lived in Aargau. He expanded his holdings with lands in Muri, and his son Radbot, who initially resided in Muri, later built the Habsberg Castle. This likely occurred between 1020 and 1030.
The castle underwent several phases of expansion, growing steadily until it reached its peak in the early 13th century, when it became a double castle.
The castle, with its inner baileys, with the remaining east tower, is an extremely modern complex that anticipates elements that were not generally introduced in castle construction until the 13th century. This underlines the importance of a power-conscious, ascending noble family, which emancipates itself from the old clan of the Ettichons and now builds its actual headquarters. As is typical of many noble families in the 11th century, as early as 1220 to 1230, the Habsburgs left their ancestral seat. From then on, they administered their territories by traveling through them.
Only a few kilometers from the Habsburg lies the Muri Monastery, which is still a mythical place for the Habsburgs today. The foundation of the monastery in 1027 goes back to Ida of Lorraine and her husband, Rodbot of Habsburg.
You found a house monastery when you have importance. The monastery provides care for elderly and sick family members, while also offering spiritual support for the dead and dying. It serves as a repository for family archives, preserving traditions and history. Additionally, the monastery is home to educated individuals, often literate in Latin, who are essential for handling the diplomatic duties of a high-ranking noble.
Originally Romanesque and Gothic in design, the building was later transformed in the Baroque style and lavishly furnished to match. The Habsburg epitaph commemorates the founders of the monastery, whose remains are interred beneath the church. Since 1971, the Laredo Chapel has been another burial place of the Habsburgs. The hearts of the last Austrian imperial couple, Zita and Karl von Habsburg, are also entombed here. When the Habsburgs first emerged in the historical record over 1,000 years ago, Europe was sparsely populated and largely covered by vast primeval forests. Few cities existed, and most were still small settlements. The founding of monasteries sparked new clearings, settlers cultivated the land, and villages began to take root. Near the Swabian town of Meeskirch, the Galley campus offers a unique opportunity to explore what a large construction site would have looked like in the early Middle Ages. Since 2013, volunteers have been reconstructing a Carolingian monastery town here, based on a plan from around the year 830. Much of the craftsmanship used in its construction was inherited from Roman antiquity.
We know, for example, that on the island of Reichenau, the books of the Roman engineer Vitruvius were copied in order to reproduce them. This indicates that the knowledge was available and disseminated. Of course, these texts were copied, studied, and likely discussed, though we don't know how much of this knowledge was actually put into practice. What we do know is that simpler construction techniques were employed, and that there was a gap between late antiquity and the Gothic period. But this wasn't due to a lack of knowledge or ability, rather it was simply a result of different circumstances and constraints.
The workers on the Campus Galley project include stonemasons, master carpenters, and bricklayers. Through their hands-on experience, scientists gain valuable insight into construction techniques used over 1,000 years ago.
It's very exciting because, as an interface between craftsmen, scientists, and engineers involved in the planning, we learn a great deal through the exchange that takes place. On one hand, the craftsmen rely on the scientists to identify which shapes, tools, and materials might have been used. On the other hand, the craftsmen contribute valuable knowledge about how these elements were actually applied, what tools might still be missing, and how long certain tasks take. This exchange is also valuable for the scientists, who gain new insights into the practical aspects of historical construction. In this way, both sides benefit from the collaboration.
It is already clear that the old knowledge about construction techniques had never been completely lost, and that there must have been a transfer of knowledge over long distances from the south over the Alps to the north.
It repeatedly shows that there was constant and intensive contact occurring regularly and systematically across the Alps. This exchange took place in part through books copied in monasteries, which were shared and helped knowledge to flourish. In addition to this, there was the movement of people, craftsmen, pilgrims, and aristocrats, who traveled, observed practices in other regions, and exchanged ideas. For example, craftsmen in the northern Alps might learn of techniques being used in Rome and bring in skilled workers to replicate them. Local craftsmen would then adopt and adapt these methods, creating a continuous flow of exchange and innovation.
The origins of the Saint Odile Monastery in Alsace date back to the 7th century. The bones of Saint Otilia, who is considered the matriarch of the Habsburgs, rest here. The founding father of the Habsburgs is Etico, also known as Adalrich, a figure well known in Alsace. Equally famous is his daughter, Saint Odile, who became the patron saint of Alsace. In this way, the Habsburgs are ultimately descended from the Etishans, establishing a clear line of continuity. The Etishans' origins lie in Alsace, at the foot of the Vosges Mountains, in a place now known as Mont Saint Odile, which was originally called Hohenberg. The name Hohenberg means upper castle, one of several castles owned by Etico. He bequeathed it to his daughter Odile to establish a monastery there. While the Odilienberg Monastery is regarded as the mythical birthplace of the Habsburgs, Alsace, located in eastern France on the border with Germany, is the ancestral heartland of the dynasty. Numerous castles and ruins crowd the wooded hilltops of the Vosges, and the picturesque villages still carry German names, such as Kaisersberg and Turkheim. These are lasting traces of a time when parts of Alsace were part of the Austrian territories and were administered from the imperial court in Innsbruck. The small wine village of Kienzheim is particularly closely linked to the history of the Habsburgs. In the 16th century, one of the most important imperial generals, Lazarus von Schwendi, resided in Kienzheim Castle. The shared history has always had a special significance for Jean Klinkert. In 2001, he founded the association In the Footsteps of the Habsburgs, from which the Via Habsburg emerged as a European cultural route in 2013.
This story unfolds across a region spanning Alsace, Tyrol, northwestern Switzerland, and the Black Forest, and centers on the Habsburgs. Specifically, Johanna von Fürth from Ferret in southern Alsace, who married Albrecht II of Habsburg. Alsace remained under Habsburg control for 5 centuries. Notably, Rudolf of Habsburg, born on the Rhine, constructed the Hollensburg Castle above Colmar in 1270.
Hatte in den Jahren 1270 zum Beispiel oberhalb von Colmar das Schloss Hollensburg gebaut.
The impressive Hollensburg Castle, perched high above the Rhine Valley, has been partially restored and is now a popular destination for visitors. In 1281, it came under the control of Rudolf of Habsburg, who was already king of Germany. For him, it was crucial to strategically secure the western lands of the empire, in addition to the recently acquired eastern duchies of Austria and Styria.
Das Elsass kam später zum Frankreich.
Alsace later became part of France through the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. But its connection to the Habsburgs remains deeply ingrained in the region.
Habsburger bleibt auch im Elsass sehr lebendig, da wir ein
The Alemannic dialect, or Alsatian, is still spoken, and, for example, the coats of arms of Upper Alsace continue to feature the crowns of the Habsburgs.
der Habsburger.
Half-timbered buildings characterize the townscape of the many small villages at the foothills of the Vosges. They are surrounded by extensive vineyards where grape varieties such as Pinot Blanc, Pinot Gris, or Chardonnay have been grown for centuries. In Alsace, even the history of viticulture is interwoven with that of the Habsburgs. The St. Stephen Wine Brotherhood now resides in the castle of Kienzheim, which once belonged to Lazarus von Schwendi. The former owner of this castle was General Colonel Lazarus von Schwendi, who served under Emperor Charles V and Maximilian II. During his time, the Ottomans had taken the city of Tokaj, which was part of the Holy Roman Empire. Schwendi led his army to push back the Ottomans, liberating Tokaj. According to legend, in gratitude, he was presented with 4,000 barrels of wine and grapevines to plant in the region. In gratitude for his pioneering deeds, the city of Colmar had a statue of the hard-drinking general erected in the 19th century. Once a year, the wine queens and members of the Wine Brotherhood gather in the cellars of Kienzheim Castle to assess the condition of the stored wines.
Every year, a wine tasting is held, and the wines selected for this event receive a seal of quality, a prestigious premium seal of excellence. In French, they call it d'excellence. These are the best of the best wines, which are stored here in the cellar. Each winemaker, when their wine is selected, places 12 bottles in the cellar. Currently, there are 60,000 bottles resting here. Each bottle has a seal of quality with a number, allowing you to easily trace its origin and identify the winemaker. You often have delightful surprises with wines that are 10, 20, 30, 50, and 60 years old. It's a bit like a story, a memoir of Alsace wines. There are bottles in the cellar from wineries that no longer exist, but it's still a pleasure to taste these bottles.
The Alsatians take pride in their tradition, including the fact that the imperial court was also supplied with wine from Kienzheim. Of course, the Habsburgs enjoyed drinking Alsatian wine. In any case, it is written in the book of Lazarus von Schwendi. Afterward, he would always receive barrels of wine as a gift, and to show his gratitude, he would send 2 casks of Muscat Alsace wine from this region to the Habsburgs. Being one of Europe's major wine regions has shaped the identity of the area for centuries. The grape harvest in Alsace begins at the end of August, including in the vineyards of Jacques Quetin. Our family has a long history in this wine region. My ancestor, Francois Quetin, originally from Switzerland, arrived in this village in 1690 and began cultivating wine in 1720. Francois Quetin started growing grapes in the local vineyards. Since then, the company has been passed down through generations and is still 100% family-run today.
Les Habsbourg ont joué un grand rôle
The Habsburgs played a major role in Alsace.
au milieu du 15e siècle.
Around the mid-15th century, our village came into their possession.
Est venu en leur possession. Et un siècle plus tard, il y a même
A
une
century
légende,
later,
au
in the
milieu du
mid-16th
16e
century,
siècle,
there
avec
is the story of Lazarus von Schwendi, a general in the service of the Habsburgs,
un plan de Pinot Gris
who brought the Pinot Gris vine, the Tokai, from Hungary to plant and cultivate it in
et
Alsace.
le faire multiplier. Donc effectivement,
So there is indeed a strong link between Alsace and Austria, in particular through the export of historic wines. Indeed, at that time, Alsatian wines were served at the imperial court.
dans l'époque,
The Alsatians are aware of this and, of course, proud of it. Our house still exports wine to Austria, especially the Crémant d'Alsace.
Crémant d'Alsace.
As an old family of counts from Alsace, the Habsburgs also owned lands around the city of Colmar. The historical connections to the House of Habsburg are often evident in small things, such as an imperial coat of arms above the entrance to the former customs house, and are firmly anchored in the collective consciousness of the people of the region. With its historic old town, winding alleys, half-timbered houses and canals, Colmar is a popular destination for guests from near and far. If you are interested in the history of the former Western Austria, you will also find what you are looking for off the beaten track. For example, in a side valley of the Vosges, where the impressive ruins of the old Benedictine Abbey of Mirbach still stand. While the Habsburgs largely pursued regional political interests in the southwest of the empire until the 13th century, with Rudolf von Habsburg, their interests shifted to the east. The trigger was a conflict with the Bohemian King Ottokar II, who refused to recognize Rudolf's election as German king in 1273. In August 1278, the decisive battle took place near the towns of Doornkrucht and Jedischbeigen in the far northeast of Austria. Two huge armies, each with 30,000 knights, faced each other. Shortly before, the powerful Ottokar had refused to return the illegally acquired duchies of Austria, Styria, Carinthia, and Carniola to the empire, and mocked Rudolf as a poor count. In the Battle of Marchfeld, the Lion of Prague falls. Now the way was clear to further consolidate the Habsburgs' power in the empire. Rudolf was the first Habsburg on the Roman-German royal throne. His successes in the eastern part of the empire marked the beginning of a development that ultimately led to the noble clan of the Habsburgs becoming the House of Austria.
Rudolph's election as king in 1273 was a major surprise. The choice of the poor count from the southwest, who had virtually defeated the great King Ottokar, seemed unexpected. The electors, of course, were also looking out for their own interests. They didn't want a king who would become too powerful. They sought someone who could unite the empire. Some may have even wagered that the already 55-year-old man wouldn't do it for long, and that they wouldn't have to deal with a dynasty they couldn't easily remove. They were wrong, however, as Rudolf ruled for another 18 very stable years.
In addition, Rudolf had succeeded in massively expanding the Habsburg lands in the eastern part of the Holy Roman Empire. His election as king marked the end of the interregnum, a period of extreme political instability. Rudolf then began securing his newly acquired power through marriage alliances for his children.
With Rudolf von Habsburg, the impact of marriage, specifically through strategic alliances, on social advancement is clearly evident. Although Rudolf I was already 55 years old at the time of his election, his numerous children were not yet married. This allowed him to translate his family's rise in power into advantageous marriages for his children. Even by the end of the 13th century, efforts were being made to establish political ties with Bohemia. After his victory over Ottokar, Rudolf orchestrated a double wedding between two of his children and two of the late Ottokars, forming an alliance while also working to reconcile and bring the two families closer together.
With the victory over Ottokar, the so-called inheritance of the Babenbergs also fell to the Habsburgs. Numerous castle ruins in today's Upper Austria remind us of the time when the Babenbergs ruled the Duchy of Austria. Just as in the Middle Ages, the kings went from castle to castle with their entourage on horseback. A group of trail riders in the Upper Austrian Mühlviertel set out to explore the region in the footsteps of the Habsburgs. Their experience helps to understand the distances that could be covered on horseback many centuries ago, and the logistical effort involved.
The average riding speed was about 6 to 7 kilometers per hour, and the daily distances typically ranged from 50 to 60 kilometers, unless there was urgency. In that case, it was possible to cover up to 100 kilometers, though you would have had to change horses, as no single horse could manage that distance. Since the journey often lasted several days, the distances would likely have been kept shorter to prevent the horses from tiring too quickly.
The first stop on the 5-day trail riding tour is the ruins of Ruthenstein Castle, which came into the possession of Rudolf von Habsburg in 1281 and was subsequently granted as a fief to regional noble families. The extensive complex includes the remains of an outer bailey and a main castle, covering nearly 5,000 square meters. While caring for the horses during the tour is time-consuming, it is hardly comparable to the effort required in earlier times.
You have to imagine, back then, people had to carry everything with them. Food, weapons, and the responsibility of riding long distances while ensuring the horses stayed healthy and fit. If a horse became lame, it was out of the race in the truest sense of the word. Considering that the horse for a knight was essentially the Ferrari of modern times, it was an incredibly valuable and essential tool for survival. Keeping the horses healthy and fit was crucial.
From the ruins of Ruthenstein Castle, the route continues to Prondegg Castle, which was also given as an imperial fief at times in its long history. The horses of the trail riders are stately and large, but in the Middle Ages, horses were much smaller. This size difference could be crucial for knights who rode into battle in full armor.
When you think of a war horse, you likely imagine huge horses as portrayed in movies. In reality, however, these horses typically stood around 1.45 to just over 1.5 meters tall, and there were several reasons for this. Smaller horses were more agile, and if you fell, you could get back on more quickly, an incredibly important factor during battle. Other qualities sought in these horses included strong hooves, since it was of no use if a horse became lame 20 kilometers before the battle, and courage and a clear head. Special training, often lasting up to 12 years, was given to these horses, which is why they were so valuable.
Prandegg Castle is a typical hilltop castle, built on a rock high above the valley, and, with a length of 140 meters, one of the largest fortifications in the Mulkreis. With the acquisition of the duchies of Austria and Styria, the Habsburgs have become important sovereigns and feudal lords in the eastern part of the empire. Rudolf I appointed his sons, Albrecht and Rudolf, as dukes of Carinthia and Styria, while Vienna grew increasingly important. The rise of the city on the Danube is clearly reflected in the Vienna Hofburg. Under the Habsburgs, the castle was continuously expanded from the late 13th century until the fall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1918. Today, the so-called Neue Burg houses the imperial court's hunting collection and armory. The House of Habsburg tour takes you through the collections and history of this ruling family, showcasing unique art treasures.
The House of Habsburg audio tour, accompanied by informative panel, guides visitors through an exhibition that traces the history of the Habsburg dynasty. The tour takes place in the Neue Hofburg, which reflects the Habsburgs' rule over the Austrian lands, from the beginning of their reign under Rudolf I to the end of the monarchy in 1918. The name House of Habsburg is deliberate in its ambiguity. It refers both to the residence of the Habsburgs within the Hofburg, specifically a section of the building intended for the imperial family, but never actually used due to the monarchy's fall. Additionally, it encompasses the entire dynasty, known as the House of Austria or the House of Habsburg. As far as I know, this is the first exhibition in Vienna that presents the full history of the Habsburgs, ruler by ruler, from the start of their reign in the Austrian lands through the end of the monarchy in 1918. The tour offers a unique opportunity to explore the Habsburgs' legacy in the Neue Hofburg. An extremely important aspect of the collection is the court hunting and armory, the world's most significant collection of courtly armor and weapons. Each suit of armor is like a portrait, almost a second skin of its former wearer, reflecting the occasion for which it was created. Rulers, always in need of representation, used such displays to assert their power both in smaller, intimate circles and to the outside world. Public events, marriages, baptisms, ascensions to the throne, and even funerals were often occasions for such displays. No celebration was complete without tournaments or balls, which were also public events, allowing rulers to project their authority. Since it was the imperial house, first the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire and later the emperors of Austria, only the finest was deemed acceptable. Every single piece in this collection is a work of art, showcasing the highest level of craftsmanship. This is truly the most important collection of its kind.
From Vienna, the journey leads back to the west in the footsteps of the Habsburgs, via the Black Forest to the former Austrian forelands. For many centuries, Fribourg im Breisgau was considered the cultural center of Western Austria and was the scene of a large imperial diet convened by Emperor Maximilian I in 1497 to 1498. While the Austrian forelands were first administered from Innsbruck and later from Ensisheim, Fribourg became the capital of Western Austria in 1651. Starting from his hometown of Fribourg, the journalist and author Hubert Mott Wilmot went in search of traces and traveled to the most important places of the Habsburgs in Europe.
Na, das Interessante war eigentlich auf dieser langen Reise.
The interesting part of this long journey, which could not be completed in one go, was that my photographer and I traveled for 3 years from the North Sea to Vienna. What was important to me was to highlight the remnants of the Habsburg legacy that still linger in collective memory, often subconsciously. These could be small signs on buildings like coats of arms or street names honoring Austrian emperors, such as Kaiser Joseph Strasse in Freiburg. In other words, I wanted to draw attention to these markers and place them within the broader context of Habsburg history. Another fascinating aspect of the journey was that it passed through 4 modern-day nation-states: France, Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. These regions once belonged to a larger framework established by the Habsburgs. It was exciting to trace and illustrate this historical connection.
With his travel guide to Habsburg Places of Remembrance, Hubert Mott-Wilmot aims to highlight the most beautiful Habsburg landmarks along the Via Habsburg. His goal is to raise awareness of a shared cultural heritage that transcends borders, which are anyway constantly changing.
If you look at the heritage of the Habsburgs here in Breisgau, it's reflected in specific buildings and ruins, remnants of castles founded by the Habsburgs, many of which were destroyed over time. Above all, they are testimonies of culture and lifestyle. We, the people of Baden, are often told that since 1806, our Baden identity has somewhat overshadowed the Austrian legacy. But we must not forget that we were part of Austria for 500 years. As descendants of Austrians, we are sometimes described as having a certain laissez-faire attitude. We're not always punctual, and there's always a solution being sought that doesn't necessarily adhere to the strictest rules. There's a charming, laid-back quality to this approach, as if we have a rule, but we don't always feel the need to follow it exactly.
Over 200 landmarks, from city gates to castles and burial sites, can already be explored along the European cultural route via Habsburg, with the number continuing to grow. This journey is not about nostalgically glorifying a good old time, but rather about offering a nuanced view of history. And, perhaps most importantly, it raises the question, who were the Habsburgs really?
The story of the Habsburgs and their significance in the collective consciousness has evolved over the centuries. While their legacy has been less changed in Baden, in Germany, it became increasingly overshadowed by the rise of the Prussian Empire, especially after the founding of the German Empire in 1871. As a result, the Habsburgs were increasingly associated with the East and were no longer seen as a German princely dynasty.
This also highlights how regions that are far apart can be linked by common historical references. In the southeast of Carinthia, in the lower Levant Valley, lies the Benedictine Abbey of St. Paul. Its many, sometimes unique art treasures have earned it the title Carinthia's Treasure House. The monastery was founded in 1091, long before the Habsburgs became sovereigns in the Duchy of Carinthia. Yet, a bridge can still be built from here, stretching from the early 19th century all the way back to the time of Rudolf I. For more than 200 years, the Romanesque Collegiate Church has also been the burial place of some, according to old records, imperial, royal, and ducal Austrian highest corpses, i.e. the mortal remains of early Habsburgs.
In the course of the history of the monastery, there have certainly been many points of contact with the Habsburgs. However, it became intense in 1809, when the mortal remains of the first Habsburgs were buried here. Originally, their burial place was in Königsfelden and Basel in Switzerland. Later, their remains were transferred to St. Blasien in the Black Forest. After the abbey was dissolved by the Reichsdeputation Hauptschluss, they were moved to Carinthia in 1809 and laid to rest behind the high altar in the Collegiate Church of St. Paul. The matriarch of the Habsburgs is buried here. The first great Habsburg, Rudolf I, is still buried in Speyer, while his wife, Anna Gertrude von Hohenberg, has found her final resting place here in St. Paul. Next to her is Leopold III, who died in 1386 in the Battle of Sembach, the great battle of the Habsburgs against the Confederates of Switzerland. He was also buried here in St. Paul. This is already a remarkable story, one that converges here, making this site of immense significance for the House of Habsburg.
Along with the imperial royal corpses and the Benedictine monks from St. Blasien, numerous art treasures and the important monastery library were also brought to St. Paul. Art historian Father Geerfried Sitar has been researching and publishing on the history of the monastery and the many bibliophile treasures for more than 20 years. One of the most important books is a manuscript from the late 13th century, which reports on the life and work of King Rudolf I and his son Albrecht.
The famous Ellenhard Code of the Strasbourg citizen is one of the most important historical works of all. This manuscript, written by Ellenhard, meticulously describes the rise of the Habsburgs and is considered the most important account of the dynasty's origins. Ellenhard provides detailed descriptions of the two key figures from the House of Habsburg, highlighting their personalities. He notes that Rudolf was an educated man, deeply engaged with the writings of his time. In other words, he didn't just seek power through force. He also had a spiritual vision and, above all, prioritized the well-being of his citizens.
The journey finally leads to Speyer, the place where Rudolf's life came to an end. In the cathedral lie his predecessors as Roman-German kings. Who Rudolf truly was as the first German king from the House of Habsburg may remain a mystery, shrouded in the darkness of history. This is partly because the Habsburgs often sought to elevate their status within the empire through heroic tales and legends. Symbols played a significant role in the Middle Ages, and Rudolf was a master of symbolism. That's why he chose to be buried in this cathedral. In the crypt lies Rudolf I, alongside other kings and emperors, as well as his son Albrecht, the second Habsburg to sit on the German royal throne.
This burial place in Speyerdom is, of course, highly political and highly programmatic. This is not just any burial place in the Holy Roman Empire, but it is the Imperial Grave Liga, where the great predecessor dynasties, the Salia and also the Hohenstaufen, buried their rulers. And Rudolf deliberately places himself in the tradition, especially of the Staufes. There is an empty tomb in the cathedral at this time. This is the grave that was actually intended for Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, an important Swabian ruler. As is well known, Barbarossa died during the Crusades, and his body was never found, leaving his tomb empty. This is one of the most prestigious graves, the most important one a king of the Holy Roman Empire could choose, and Rudolf chose to be buried here.
The grave slab, which has been preserved, depicts Rudolf as a ruler adorned with the insignia of power. However, the sources remain silent about the details of the funeral ceremonies.
There's an anecdotal tradition surrounding Rudolf's death. He was probably in Geimersheim, not far from Speyer, on his way to Mainz. However, sensing that death was near, he is said to have expressed a desire to be buried where more of his ancestors, his predecessors as kings and emperors of the Holy Roman Empire, lay. With the last of his strength, he chose to travel to Speyer. This may have been driven by both his connection to the monastery region and his instinct to be laid to rest alongside his ancestors. While he could have ordered his body to be transported there, he chose to ride on his own power. He was received in Speyer, and there in the cathedral, he was ultimately buried.
It was a last symbolic act by Rudolf. By choosing to be buried in Speyer, he sent a clear message. In the future, no one would question his dynasty's claim to the throne. With great political skill, Rudolf von Habsburg not only secured his own rise, but also laid the foundation for his family's ascent, ultimately establishing the Habsburgs as one of the most powerful dynasties in the empire.